So from the book, one of the kind of advantages that I give readers is a chance to submit direct questions to me, to be answered in the podcast, to be answered in videos, to be answered in the newsletters. So I'm going to do a couple of those today. Some of these are from when it was first launched in May, so there's a few to go through. So let's talk about the stuff that's going on for the readers in inclusive leadership and things they want to know about, okay? So the first one is, how can we help others understand the value of it? So one of the first things I say to everyone is, when people are talking about inclusive leadership or anything in the workplace, everybody automatically thinks, what's in it for me? So if you want to help other people understand the value of it, spend some time understanding what the value of it is for them, okay? Because otherwise you're just promoting something you like, and that's why people are often too busy and disengaged and not really, they don't know what's in it for them. They think you're asking more of them. It's one of the biggest pieces of feedback I get in the workshops is, I don't have time to do this. I'm like, if you have time not to do it, you have time to do it, because inclusive leadership and inclusion can be how we get the outcomes we want more effectively, basically. I expect that people get quite jarred about inclusive leadership being an ongoing practice as opposed to something that gets done. What helps you communicate this without it closing the person down? Okay, so the first thing is, if we reposition inclusion not as something we achieve, but as something that we do in the pursuit of our achievements, it makes a lot more sense to people. So if I say inclusion and inclusive leadership is about doing your job in a more effective way, then people aren't perceiving that inclusion is the goal. Inclusion is how we do things. And there's a really good reason that inclusion shouldn't be the goal. Because first of all, nothing is stagnant in inclusion. You can't just do inclusion and you're inclusive. When someone says we have an inclusive workplace or this is inclusive, I'm like, for who, when, why? Like, how do you know it's inclusive? Because inclusion is co-created between people. So how I stop it jarring people is saying inclusion is not the goal. Inclusion is how you do things, right? It's plain and simple. Inclusion is how you help yourself improve performance, how you help teams do well, how you achieve your outcomes, right? It is not the goal. And so we don't sit down and congratulate ourselves. We know inclusion is going well when we've attempted to use inclusive practices and we've achieved really good business outcomes. So inclusion is how we do work. It brings more ease, more effectiveness, greater odds of improved performance. So I focus on why inclusion is a practice and not some outcome. And also, look, if you practically say to people, inclusion isn't something you achieve, it makes perfect sense when you actually think about it. But some of the common traditional ways of talking about this aren't really acknowledging that. And it kind of creates a jarring and cognitive dissonance for people because they know something doesn't add up about this thing. I'm curious as to what are the most common misunderstandings about inclusive leadership. Okay, so one is that inclusive leadership, that inclusion is the goal, whereas actually inclusive leadership is about using inclusion to lead effectively and achieve organisational outcomes. The other one that drives me around the bend, and someone recently at a keynote said, what do you mean around the bend? It means I get really frustrated with it, it annoys me, is that inclusion is somehow the opposite to discrimination. Discrimination or non-discrimination are opposites. Inclusion and exclusion are opposites, but you cannot be discriminating and still not be inclusive, right? Which is why when people try to teach inclusion through the lens of discrimination, there's a big gap in it because you cannot discriminate and still not actually be inclusive. There's loads more. I've got like 107 listed, but let's just stay with that one. How do you prevent the person or people, different person from the group being labelled as the difficult one or the one that is being unreasonable? Okay, so this often happens. It's called scapegoating in group dynamics. And what happens is organizations get used to somebody constantly speaking up about something. And so what they end up doing is creating a reputation for themselves and stop themselves being kind of like more effective, basically. And what we need to do is, if speaking up isn't working, then you need to be influencing people in a different way. Otherwise, you're just creating a dynamic where you're going to get excluded or you're going to be labelled as difficult. And you can say, oh, that's not fair, they're labelling me as difficult. I would say if you're using the same approach and it's not working and you keep using it, you probably are being difficult because you're not improving your approach to influence. Nobody likes to hear that. But the reality is our job is to make sure that we are influencing and being effective, not that we just keep banging our heads or keep lecturing people. So we need to think a little bit about the different approaches that we're taking. Okay, this one's really good. How to make sure people invest the time and effort that is needed to be good at this. The first thing is the same time and effort that it takes to develop anything around leadership, right? You could just integrate inclusion. I think the big issue is that people want to give people lectures on inclusion and then wonder why they don't want to come to the assessments or the training or the development days, because you don't need loads of extra time to be inclusive. In fact, it helps you be more effective, but you might need to stop your automatic reactions and automatic kind of jumping to action and to take a moment to understand it so that you save time in the long run. So I really push back on the idea that inclusion takes longer. I think inclusion requires smarter efforts, but in the long run, it can really prevent losing a lot of wasted time in the wrong direction. And this can be an issue in workplaces because sometimes we feel more productive because we're moving, even if we're not moving in a very cohesive or effective direction or aligned direction. What do you mean by the difference of social and organisational inclusion? I'm not sure I agree. Lovely. So basically, inclusion in different settings has different boundaries to it. In society, I always position it that inclusion is about including the people that are currently in our society and treating them in a dignified way. And I can go into that when I think about my activist work, or I think about my attempt to influence society to be more inclusive and be more respectful of people's human rights. But in an organisation, you don't automatically have a right to belong. You only belong because you add value to the organisation. And so inclusion is not just based on you existing and wanting to be part of the organisation. Inclusion is based on you adding value to the organisation. So if you've become distracted from adding value to the organisation, then your inclusion and your efforts might not be very helpful. And this can happen sometimes. People get distracted from the purpose of their role in their organisation because they become preoccupied with areas of interest. And then we can see issues like people being excluded because they're now being identified with their kind of mission in the workplace and not actually their roles and responsibilities and the requirement that they have to deliver value to the organisation. How do I approach people when I don't know what to say or don't want to cause offence? Really lovely. So the first thing I would say about that is it's probably worth, one of the things I always say when I know that I'm kind of like in tricky ground is I say things like, I'll need some grace here because I'm not going to say this well and I'm open to correction. And then I'll say the thing. Or I'll say, I'm not sure the right way to say this. How would you like to be described? Or I'll talk about the system. And this is something I learned from Myra Chan. Instead of saying race or something like saying a thing or sexuality, I'll say people are marginalised by. And so what I'm doing is I'm pointing my focus at the system causing the harm rather than trying to put somebody into a box based on an identity term that I've been taught. The other thing is I have an approach called FAR, which is about how you deal with people saying like you've been offensive or discriminatory or harmful or any of those things, right? And it's a really important approach. It's in the book, but also I've written about it in different places because it's about feeling what it feels like, because in that moment you're likely to feel shame, defensiveness, all of those things. It's about accepting how the person experiences it. It's about researching, so later going and checking if can you learn about it without making it the person's responsibility. And then the fourth thing is, do you repair? Sometimes it's appropriate to go to the person and repair, and sometimes it's not. It's just appropriate for you to repair in the future. So there's multiple points in the relationship with people where offence could be caused. Now, let me be really clear. There is a difference between offence, which is I take offence by something, and something that is kind of more universally accepted as offensive, like the use of certain language. And I don't want to mix up the two because individuals have a lot of power over what offence they take. And that's still true in this work. But there are universal things that we know are highly offensive, people still utilise. And I'm not, like, when those things happen, it's very important that we reflect on them and learn from them. And then there are times where we won't agree with their experience of, what they're offended by. Now, what we do with that is an interesting one. Do we decide that they're wrong and we're right, or vice versa? Or do we say, well, actually, I want to have a good functional relationship with this person, so I'm going to take their feedback on board and utilize it in building a relationship with them, whether it's in this one conversation or an extended thing. So we have a couple of decisions we have to make, and that's why inclusion and inclusive leadership isn't a one-size-fits-all type of thing, because quite frankly it's more complex than that. It's interpersonal, it's systemic, it's about how you relate to things, how you adapt, how you change. It's not about a set of rules and structures that you just get right and you either know or you don't know, or you're good or you're a bad person. It's none of those things. I love this question. I'm going to finish on this. Is it too much? I get this question a lot where people say, oh, this is a policy in my organisation, or is that too much? Has it gone too far? It's never, by the way, it's very rarely by the person who benefits by the change. It's usually by people there's higher expectations required of them than previously. Sometimes things go too far because people become distracted by the purpose. Okay. So in my work, I say it depends on the organization's purpose. It depends on what need that approach or effort is making. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And so sometimes it is too much if you're just ticking boxes, giving people a load of language rules, but they don't really understand the purpose of it. It might not actually have a positive impact. It might have no impact at all. Sometimes people are doing it because they're virtue signaling, because they're copying the other organizations or other leaders. It's too much if it doesn't really respond to a need, a real need. And if it responds to the need, but it doesn't meet the need, then it might be too much, or it might be off the wall. It isn't too much if it identifies a real need, responds to the need, and helps solve that need being met. Then it's not too much. So these are just some of the thoughts that readers have shared with me from reading Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organisational Complexity, which is my book that made the Irish Times bestseller list, the Sunday Independent, and several Amazon bestseller lists this May and June and July. It's also a resource that anyone who buys the book has access to. You just put in the questions, I answer them. But it's also a really helpful thing to be able to do, is to kind of see if your interpretation of what's within the book is accurate. Now, on top of that, there's really great resources, including visual aids, cheat sheets, reflective worksheets, all of that jazz. And if you leave a review of the book on Amazon or any site and you screenshot it and send it to us, we give you access to a self-assessment to check your leadership practice, your inclusive leadership practice. So if you have any questions, you don't have to just use that form, because that form's only available to people who have access to the resources in the book. So you can buy the book and do that. But you can also send me private DMs and I collate them, or emails. The links are below. I collate them and then I answer them in kind of a monthly-ish piece of work. Yeah, and so I'm just going to read one thing from the book, just as a kind of like little closing. Inclusive leadership is the effective use of inclusion practices in all forms of leadership, whether positional, thought, or social leadership, throughout an organisation, with the purpose of co-creating inclusive, psychologically safe, high-performing organisations. I hope you enjoy.